Welcome to Psychologist Talks. On today's episode, I want to talk a little bit about, I would say, guys, the pros and cons of when there are similarities versus differences between a patient and a provider around lived experiences, shared demographics, or I guess shared kind of contextual experiences. And I'll define that in a minute. So again, I'll talk a little bit about why differences between therapist and patient could be beneficial and helpful. But then, spoiler alert, kind of head into and lead into why I think there's a net positive when patient and therapist or patient and provider share lived experiences and context. Now, I want to note I say therapist because that's the nature of my channel, right? It is mental health focus. I would very much bargain we could extrapolate or generalize this between like helper and helpee. I mean, anybody in the helping profession. Similarities and differences between the helper and the helpee, I think, are big. They make a big difference on the impact of care. So I hope this is a generalizable episode in that regard. So let me define what I mean by like lived experiences and demographics and context. It is intentionally broad, and then I'll jump into the, pros and cons of the differences as well as the similarities. When I mean lived experiences, demographics, context, it is intentionally broad and all-encompassing. So if it sounds that way, it is supposed to be that way. The traditional variables that are discussed, I think more often than not, are more demographically inclined. Like, we share a similar race, a similar gender, similar religious orientation or belief system, whatever it might be. But I would extend that well beyond those sort of more demographic variables and actual experiences that in of themselves. Have you, a big thing in kind of therapy is like, have you experienced a marriage or a committed long-term relationship if you're providing me couples or marital counseling? If I'm coming in for help and it involves the stress and the sort of layered nature of parenthood, are you too a parent? If I'm having a conflict of faith, do you have any faith tradition upon which you draw, and are they similar or at least reasonably aligned? But it could really expand well beyond that. What kind of relationships have you been? What kind of traumas have you been exposed to? Have you been in positions of power? If I'm coming from a position of power and looking for advice of how to navigate that, have you been in disempowered or oppressive experiences that inform you? More often than not, I think patients are more inclined also in that demographic area. It's like, you got kids, right? Very young clinicians often run into this. Just because it's like, hey, you don't have a ton of life experiences. I'm willing to listen to you, but the fact that you haven't experienced this is a little bit challenging. And again, we'll go into the pros and cons of this. I would, generally say most people are looking for areas of similarity to proceed forward. And we see this in all walks of life. Like these sorts of biases exist even in employment. And employee selection can be subject to looking for aspects of similarity as a judgment of goodness of fit, when in reality, those aspects of sameness have nothing to do with goodness of fit for the position, the job, the duty at hand, right? So we're inclined to do this naturally, and it's a natural process, particularly in therapy, because therapy is a very vulnerability-forward milieu. I mean, it's like, hey, if I'm going to share my heart, my soul, especially if I've done this therapy gig a few times, I want to be sure there's a good fit. So, that's I think what often happens on the front end. But again, wildly expansive category, and it's meant to be. Anything applies. Any aspect of similarity, any aspect of difference. Are you more introverted? Have you experienced depression or not? Have you, anything at all? Now, there's, and I'll start with differences because I think in my line of training, there was a lot of emphasis on like, hey, differences are inevitable. And that is absolutely true. I mean, the amount of times I can count on one hand that there were multiple lived experiences and or multiple contexts from which I have arisen that are the same as a client are very small. I mean, like one or two shared is not, that's statistically very probable. But when you get to like 5, 6, 7, it gets a little uncanny, right? Like my fellow providers can probably speak to this, especially if they've been in the field a while. These cases, while rare, are remarkable because you immediately feel pull. I don't care if you're the most behavioral of behaviorists, and there's an immediate relational pull because someone is walking an almost eerily similar path as you. In those situations, I think, again, they are uncanny in their own right and call for a lot of attention. But more often than not, there's more differences than there are similarities. I know that might sound weird because we're so much in this world of well, we're all more alike than we are different. It's yeah, but people's narratives are incredibly rich and incredibly complicated, and each step in the narrative is so unique in its own right. You do the math and there becomes these exponential millions of possibilities of the combinations therein. And so any similarity between you and I is overshadowed by and large by a lot of difference. And so it's rightful for training programs to focus on areas of difference and saying hey, you can still be helpful, right? Hey, you young, less assured clinician, person who's launching into the field, this does not hinder your ability to be objective and help people. And I believe that to be absolutely true. Why is that absolutely true? Even if you're meeting with a seasoned clinician, if you're a patient or a consumer, why is this non-detrimental, if not potentially beneficial to provider-patient relationships? Well, getting a third eye that has not walked a mile provides a perspective that you cannot get necessarily the same with someone who has. Who has proverbially kind of walked a similar enough mile, and is truly an objective position because they have nothing else from which to draw. They're simply hearing you as you describe something natively, authentically to you, and reflecting from a position of absolute not knowing, and that is of benefit. We need only look at the danger of echo chambers to appreciate this benefit. This is the whole notion of why, more left-leaning, I guess. I don't know why it's left-leaning, but why diversity is such an important thing, is it expands our horizons and our perspectives because we get to see and hear something that we otherwise would not if we were talking to someone who is too similar or alike us. And this can include just mentalities and personalities, etc. It doesn't have to be race, it doesn't have to be gender. Any diversity is usually quite beneficial. And so why would therapy, why would a provider-patient relationship be any different? Similarly, I think, it's kind of saying maybe the same thing is hearing it from someone who's not the same as us is going to hit a little bit differently. This is where, one of the common preferences when it comes to provider-patient match is gender. It's when I talk to people, it's well, how do you feel about me being a male and you being a female, or me being a male and you being a male? And people will often say, if it's an area of difference, male and female, they'll say well, it's helpful. I feel like I need a perspective that is not of my own gender. I feel like I need a relationship with a male and to encounter these issues with a male because it challenges me in some sort of way. And so that lack of sameness, if anything, can be of utmost benefit. It can. However, I've already mentioned, I believe at the end of the day, areas of similarity, whether it's a lived experience or context or demographic variable, is a net positive. And the reason why is I think the myth is that areas of similarity create danger, that there's something to be feared about them, at least on the provider side, at least in the era that I was trained, which admittedly was before they talked a little bit more about the importance of similarities in match. I think usually because it was a cultural push that came after my time. But, more often than not, those areas of similarity are going to access something that is very hard to access otherwise. And then the myth of the danger is more about the individual than it is about the fact that there's an area of similarity. Now, what I mean by that is that usually in my training and in my 10 plus years of training other people, usually it's a more widespread issue to default to a position of what I call quote unquote knowing. That there's, to take an area of similarity and then to assume knowing is somewhat of a bold step, and usually a step that replicates itself in other places in that provider's life. Now, we're all prone to this to a minor degree, but the emphasis is on a minor degree. I mean, this overt risk that an area of similarity is going to keep us like blind to objectivity is, to me, nothing but fear. It's a reasonable fear to encourage a newer, younger provider to be careful and mindful of, but it is an overestimated risk so long as we are trained in and know how to manage and notice our own countertransference. So that, say, if it's a more conflictual area of sameness, say both provider and patient have gone through a divorce, the provider is not inadvertently or consciously projecting their unresolved conflicts onto the patient and thereby kind of interrupting a more native, curious, open-minded, objective approach. So that is a task. I want to note, if you or your provider or whomever struggle with kind of self-awareness, now often the self-aware are not aware of that lack of self-awareness, but if there is that difficulty managing a particular topic of sameness, then you got to know your boundaries, right? And say like, I tend not to meet with divorcees because I'm kind of still working through my own stuff. I tend not to meet with people with those types of traumas because I'm not sure if I've fully resolved my own. And that's a responsible kind of separation and saying, hey, I know the sameness could be powerful, but this is too dicey for me. But as long as there's that general sense that it's a net positive, why is it a net positive? To me, the essence of what makes areas of similarity important, next to just relationally being with someone who has at least walked an iota of a mile with us. I mean, that sort of solidarity is important. But I think the power of the provider is that they can see and discern and ask and inquire and all sorts of things based on that sort of similar enough experience or context. They can draw links between things that someone who has not been through the experience or has not had that sort of identity, they can see it more easily, more clearly, and narrow focus to it or towards it. Now, this comes a little bit ahead with people when providers like the patient always knows best. I'm just kind of here and I receive whatever they offer me. If they're, if the provider is not terribly curious, doesn't insert themselves as much, to me, the benefits of similarity begin to go out the window. My personal belief, while clients coming in know a ton about themselves, and I would never be so audacious to claim I know more, I think people who are self-aware enough will usually direct themselves out of their problems in ways that are either requiring only short-term therapy or they don't need therapy at all. If they're coming to see me, and as people often ask of me, they're looking for my reflections so that they might see something that they do not immediately see for themselves. And that's not saying you know better, it's just the third eye, the power of the third eye. I don't know what this is if you're watching. Is that an eye? I don't know. The power of the third eye. And so the more informed the third eye is, whether it's through knowledge around research or lived experience and similarities in context, the better equipped they are to see that which is harder to see, to connect dots that the clients, you possibly, might not be connecting of your own volition, but once seen through this third eye, is like, oh, there it is, right? And it propels forward a process that might have taken months otherwise. Again, not because the provider is saying like, oh, I know exactly how you feel, boom, mic drop all the time, but they just, again, they're like, I hear what they're saying, and yet I'm curious about this other thing based on my knowledge of this lived experience. And that's incredibly powerful. That is incredibly powerful. Now, the power of that is amplified the more unique or kind of rare the problem is, either globally or within a particular kind of context or setting. So if someone is in a traditionally marginalized population but is in a big, diverse city, there's typically less of an issue around sameness. I mean, there can still be global kind of macro socio-political system issue, but they're less isolated in some aspect of their identity. This is very different if you're meeting with someone in an incredibly small town, where, yeah, we understand there's more diversity in the greater context in the greater world, but in their micro system, they feel very insulated. And so those areas of sameness and similarity can be of undue importance, not because the provider becomes a savior, but because it I guess it adds to that sort of solidarity piece. So not only is there the power of perspective, it becomes even more powerful of like, hey, you're not alone. And we know how powerful destigmatizing and feeling not alone in our problems can indeed be. So to me, there's nothing wrong with lots of areas of difference between a provider and a patient. Rather, all I'm saying is there's an incremental potential benefit to areas of sameness and similar lived experience, so long as the provider and patient are diligent in not assuming anything and or projecting anything onto one another. Now, it sounds like an absolute. I should gently note, at least noticing. You don't have to prevent the assumptions or projections, but if they do occur, call them out and process through why those are happening. But I digress. At the end of the day, I think similarities are a net positive. So, as always, thank you for listening, watching, and stay curious.